Thanks very much. That takes us on then to section 3, which is deputations. Could I ask Keith Giblett to come forward from Queensferry and District Community Council, please? Welcome. Just a reminder that you have 10 minutes to speak to committee. Thank you.
Good morning. As you say, my name is Keith Giblett. I'm Chair of Queensferry and District Community Council. Thank you for allowing me to address the Transport and Environment Committee at short notice here today. I only learned about the Public Transport Priority Action Plan report earlier this week, hence the reason for the short notice. I would hope that the Environment and Transport Committee are aware of the place standard. How good is your place? In fact, I hope that some of you might have used it and been involved in your own communities using the place standard, as Queensferry and District Community Council have. Place standard consultations were held in Queensferry in 2015-16, driven by the Scottish Government and undertaken jointly and willingly by council planning officers and the Community Council. Queensferry was one of the first communities to undertake this exercise. The Queensferry's Place Standard Report takes the form of being a planning guideline document approved by full council, yes, the previous administration. QGCC understood that this extensive piece of work would be used by developers and council officers to plan for the future of the town. What with the prospect of 40% growth with housing developments, not just from LDP2, but prior approved developments. And that QDCC would be engaged in delivering the improvements, particularly with the new build housing identified and now approved in the local development plan. The place standard takes the form of a report and a spider's graph. The low scores in place standard that are relevant, I feel, to this report are the influence and sense of control that the community has and the Community Council has over the developments in their community, the impacts from vehicles and public transport provision. Is it too much to ask to be given some control that allows elected members and community councillors to engage in the work of minimising that impact from vehicles and car parking, and jointly working together, working up solutions to try to solve these problems? Would that not have been a better way of bringing forward a report to the Transport and Environment Committee if we had had some say and some input into this report? After considerable effort from volunteers, the Community Council thought that through the place standard we had secured a satisfactory level of understanding with the City of Edinburgh Council. How wrong and naive are we to believe that? Further, that the report makes no mention of the Local Development Plan 2 principles, which stated increased car parking at Dalmeny Station as an intervention would be necessary to support the new housing developments. At the last Planning Sub-Development Committee meeting, this was dismissed without a second thought, despite some questions from committee members, which too were immediately dismissed. I would contest on behalf of the Community Council that the following matters in the report are incorrect. 3.60, that is not the new housing development from the old industrial site, which is in fact called Dalmeny Park, that has substantially increased demand. The homes are immediately adjacent to the station. The demand is from outlying areas of Queensferry, Kirkliston, the villages of the east side of West Lothian, and demand caused by the former poor bus service operated by Stagecoach prior to Lothian buses taking up the 43 service, with residents looking for reliable public transport. 3.62. When the council officers were carrying out the survey that they refer to, Why did they not reach out to QDCC and engage with us? I don't think that is a lot to ask. But 3.62 does confirm the view that increased demand is coming from other areas, and specifically states Kirkliston. As I've already said, it's not just Kirkliston. Community Council has carried out its own surveys. In fact, we did a few during the discussions for the Dalmeny Park development. And it's apparent the site is used as a small parking ride, that people park up there to then get the bus, cycle, run or walk. 3.65 makes some interesting observations, but makes no mention of how these improvements might be delivered. How would expansion at the Ingliston Park and Ride and improved tram journey times help Dalmeny Station? I cannot see how that would resolve or help to resolve our parking problems. In fact, what you will do is have people travelling from Queensferry by car to Ingliston, therefore putting additional traffic on the new bridge gyratory. 3.66 states there is no council land, but the new high school build might free up land on the south east side of the high school. Might we not have a look at some innovative ideas? 3.67 refers to parking expansion, increasing the demand. However, is the objective not to reduce car journeys into Edinburgh? Our constituents want to use the train, which is fast and efficient mode of travel into the Gyle, Haymarket and of course the city centre. And it is evidenced by 50% growth in 5 years. And of course, not forgetting travel to Fife, which I think often seems to be forgotten. 3.71 refers to a strategic study, so another study, another holding position. Why put off till tomorrow? What you can do today comes to mind. We know the problem, so let's work on some solutions. The report makes no mention of other transport matters, which are considerable and emanate from the opening of the Queensferry crossing. The closure of the Eckland southbound slip has seen a model shift in traffic in Queensferry, moving in the east direction across the town. Hence, numerous complaints have been received from residents. It's a bit of disappointment as Chair of the Community Council to be appealing to this committee that this report brings the place standard consultation, I feel, the whole process into disrepute. It's an engagement tool, but will not work if one of the parties refuses to engage. Further, the cause and effect of non-engagement questions the investment in time by all involved. There was significant council officer time, and the value of the process, I feel, is being ignored. Today, I am asking you and seeking your support to have the Dalmeny train station sections 3.59 to 3.71 carried over and revised through meaningful discussion between council officers, community council and ward councillors for the reasons I have outlined. As there is no public transport priority action plan or strategy for Dalmeny Station or Queensferry as a whole, it's an abysmal piece of work. Thank you for your time and your considerations.
Thank you for your presentation. I wonder if I can open this up to any questions from the floor. Okay. You've clearly covered an enormous amount in that deputation, and I'm aware that some of the issues that you've raised sit around planning, which of course is not the remit of this committee. I think it might be a sensible solution if, not solution, it's the wrong word, but a sensible step forward if we put in place a meeting between yourselves and traffic officials and planning in order to explore further some of these issues. Is that something that would be acceptable to you?
Convener, thank you. That is acceptable in a way, but I'd like it recorded and find that if the priority, public transport priority action plan was approved, then we do not take a step forward because there is no recognition of the issues that we're suffering from in Queensferry. I'm concerned that this is approved. Over time, we have invested a lot of our volunteers' time in trying to work with council officers, and I'm particularly disappointed that at this point the Community Council and our ward councillors have not been engaged in this process. It's a bit late in the day to be engaged, and therefore if the report goes through, it will be another whitewash exercise. I'm sorry, I don't see it.
I would just mention the fact that this is a report not specifically about the Dalmeny situation. This is a city-wide report looking at all aspects of public transport priority action plan. And for that reason alone, we're looking at it on a much broader basis than the scope of your deputation this morning. But thank you very much for the contribution. I think I'd like to invite Paul Lawrence to speak on this now.
Just very briefly, Convener, I think the suggestion of a detailed meeting with transport and planning officials is a constructive one, and I hope that's well received. Members just be aware, and some I think do, that Mr Giblett wrote to me on the wider issues that you raise about the relationship between the place standard work, which I think was well received and well delivered in Queensferry, and then the follow-up, and this is one example of the kind of follow-up actions, and the way in which that strategic work is then followed up with individual decisions. And we were just saying before committee that we're trying to get that discussion in the diary in early September, and I will take officials there to look at how we then move from these kind of strategic pieces of work into more detailed decision making, and I'll be undertaking that over the next few weeks with the Community Council.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd invite you to go back to the public gallery, please, and then invite Councillor Lang to come down and join us. Can
I just ask one question? Can I have acknowledged then that in the report that the Dalmeny car park situation is one that representations has been made, and we find that the report is not meaningful nor helpful towards the long-term solutions, finding long-term solutions. I accept the kind offer by Convener and Mr Lawrence. Thank you.
I think given the fact that you've raised some serious concerns and that we would want to investigate those a bit further in consultation with the relevant departments, including some who are not represented here today, I think what I'd prefer to do, if this is acceptable to you, is to note what you've said. I don't think I'd want to make a change to the report at the moment, because, as I mentioned, the report is about a strategic direction for the whole of the city. But your presence here today, the recording of it on the webcast and so on, I think will be enough, and we'll take on board what you've said, and it will obviously inform the discussions that will follow between yourself and our officials, and indeed further discussions internally to the Council. I hope that that will be sufficient for you. I can assure you that we have listened very carefully to what you've said, and that we'll be furthering the discussions internally as well on that basis. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Councillor Lang.
Good morning, Councillor Lang. Just a reminder, you have 3 minutes to speak to committee. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Given the time constraints, I really want to cut to the chase. My number one objective here with Dalmeny Station is to try and minimise the number of people who are driving into Edinburgh. We already face intolerable traffic and congestion on the A90 and the Barrington Junction, congestion which we know impacts upon the reliability of public transport. Queensferry Road is one of the most polluted roads, not just in Edinburgh, but anywhere in Scotland. And this was the reason why both Councillor Young and myself brought forward our motion last October to try and get an action plan on the access arrangements around Dalmeny Station, because of our concern that the issues currently at the station risk meaning motorists are now choosing to drive into Edinburgh via Barnton. And that motion, which was passed with all party support, agreed for an action plan, including proposals to further maximise sustainable transport to and from the station, along with improved parking arrangements. Now, it is now almost 10 months since that motion was passed, and candidly, Convener, both Councillor Young and I were expecting a lot more in terms of the final report. The motion called for an action plan, but what I think we have is more of a description of the current situation, a suggestion that changes could be looked at some indeterminate point in future through future reviews, and very little in the way of tangible and timetabled actions. Now, it's important to remember, Convener, that I had originally sought a report in 2 cycles and accepted in good faith an amendment from Councillor Booth that this should be moved to 3 cycles. That took us to May, but May came and went without the report. And I was subsequently told that without any consultation or prior notification, the report was delayed till August. I was then informed that I wouldn't get a standalone report and that the issues relating to Dalmeny Station would be subsumed into this wider action plan on public transport. Now, last week officials were very good enough to share with me the draft report text and specifically asked for feedback. I went back with a 12-point list of problems and queries, yet not a single change, not a single word was altered following my feedback. Convener, it is difficult for me, or for my constituents, like Keith, who you have heard from, to feel that these issues have been properly looked at or given sufficient focus, given the cross-party support from Council almost 10 months ago. There is a lack of clarity in the report and a lack of clear timescales. There has been no use made of the major traffic study, which was conducted by local transport officials just last month. No reference at all to the requirements of the LDP, which specifically includes additional car parking facilities. No report on the discussions with Transport Scotland. No mention of the developer contributions being secured for active travel improvements. Convener, I do not believe this report is good enough, especially given the 10 months which has been available to prepare it. And so that is why I am asking members to support the amendment that has been tabled so a more thorough report and action plan can be developed. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lang. There's an enormous amount in what you've just said. I reiterate the fact that this is a report that is designed to deal with the strategic citywide issues. The specifics around Dalmeny Station have to be part of that wider discussion as well. Whilst I recognise your degree of frustration about timing, I also believe that we have to get our solutions correct across the city as well as at a local level. I think I'd like to invite Ewan Kennedy to comment on some of the specifics of what you've been saying.
Thank you, Convener. The motion is, in essence, at 2 levels. There's a level looking at the existing situation, the management issues around that, and looking at how measures could be brought forward to address the issues being raised. The second part of the motion is really looking at a strategic level, and I think that's reflected in your comments, Councillor Lang, with the A90 and the role that Park and Ride in the wider region has the opportunity to play to address some of the issues that you raise, and Dalmeny potentially is part of that solution. The existing Park and Ride site has been now developed to a kind of scale that it's encroached on the immediate available land around it. It's difficult to see solutions along the expansion that has been undertaken thus far. Most recently, there's been an additional 60 spaces come forward as a result of development. The general view is that further expansion of the Park and Ride site will require a solution that will effectively expand the Park and Ride site on its current footprint. The Council does not own all the land associated with that. Any technical solution is likely to be fairly complex, fairly expensive. It would require agreement with other partners, ScotRail, Network Rail, and a decision around that type of initiative is one that really needs to be undertaken in that wider regional context. Your motion asked us to discuss this with Transport Scotland and also with ScotRail, and we have done that. And the consensus is that there is a piece of work that is programmed by Transport Scotland. It's the Strategic Transport Project Review number 2. And the whole raft of issues, and you highlight it, I think, well, when you stand and look at the A90 and the traffic that is present, and the solutions to addressing that. A lot of the interventions will lie in neighbouring authorities, potentially park and ride sites in West Lothian or in Fife, etc. And it may well be that Dalmeny is part of that mix. But at this point in time, we don't actually have the evidence to come to a conclusion on that. So in setting out the approach in response to your motion, we have considered it at that strategic level and said that we will include Dalmeny in that wider piece of analysis, and that will be subject to further report. In terms of the management issues that exist there just now, we have put forward ideas to be developed to strengthen active travel links to the station, to strengthen potentially public transport links to the station. We're conscious that it seems to be attractive to Kirkliston. We highlighted the potential of Ingleston as an alternative to those travelling from Kirkliston. That was the intention around that. So I think I find it unjustified criticism that there aren't proposals there waiting to be developed, both at a strategic level and at a local level. Can I just go further? I acknowledge that your report asked for a response in 3 cycles. We have done an awful lot of work in this, and we've engaged with other stakeholders. It was an oversight on my part that I didn't contact you to advise you that the report had been delayed. Once I realised that, I arranged a meeting with you, and we met, and I apologised to you. And we had, I thought, a very positive and fruitful discussion in terms of our way forward and setting out what's contained in the report before us today. In terms of the email you sent to Stuart Lowry with your observations around the content, I think everyone was addressed by Stuart in return email to you, setting out kind of clarifications around the issues that you'd raised.
Do we have any questions for Councillor Lang? Councillor Booth?
Thanks, Convener. Thanks very much indeed, Councillor Lang, for your presentation. And as you correctly identified, it was my amendment that sought the report in 3 cycles instead of 2. And I share your frustration that at the delay in this report coming forward, and that it doesn't sufficiently explore many of the issues that you raised. However, as we've also heard from officers, I think we recognise that there are no easy solutions to this. Many of them will involve planning applications, and it's a tricky solution, tricky ask to find a way forward on this. I also absolutely hear the frustrations of the Community Council, and I think that trust appears to have broken down between council officers and the community, and that's not acceptable. We need to ensure that that trust is rebuilt. My questions to you, Councillor Lang, are twofold. Firstly, I accept that the primary committee that should be driving this forward is this committee, but I wonder if there's also a role for the locality committee, where the councillors there will also have much more detailed knowledge of the issues that are raised, and I wonder whether it might be appropriate for us to refer this issue on to that locality committee in addition to maintaining it on our agenda. And I also wonder, and this is perhaps a question either for you or for officers, is there a role in this in Sestran as well, because Dalmeny is so close to a number of our borders with neighbouring authorities? Is there a role in taking a sort of strategic approach to this, to say, can we get collaboration between some of our neighbouring authorities to look at some of the issues that you've raised?
Thank you. Take your first point. I mean, I don't pretend that these are really simple things to solve. I think, in reality, where there's been a lot of frustration, not just amongst myself, but you've heard it from the Community Council, you hear it from residents, is often a lack of timetable or deadlines that sit around this. And it's born out of history and experience where promises are made in good faith, but yet other priorities come in, other work comes in, and this just gets put to one side. So whilst I don't pretend that this is something that can be solved by this time next week, and there are a lot of partners involved, a lot of strategic issues, it's the lack of timescales, it's the lack of deadlines, it's the lack of clarity around how long these things are going to take. Because I also want to provide some realistic expectation for my own constituents. On your locality committee point, I absolutely agree, and for what it's worth, I think there's a wider point here. This is just the kind of thing where I do think locality committees should be involved. I think where we're still a little bit uncertain as a council is what decision-making powers these committees have. And already I think there's a slight risk that they become talking shops as opposed to actual committees with delegated authority to take decisions. So I agree with you, let's trust local members to be able to discuss these and take decisions. What I'm genuinely not clear on right now in terms of governance is what actual decision-making is available to a locality committee as opposed to an executive committee like this.
Councillor Gloyer, I think you were wanting to ask a question. Oh, sorry, Ewan, you want to contribute? Yes, please. Yes, thank you.
One of the discussions that we've been having with Transport Scotland on that wider strategic piece of work is the governance around that. And through the closure of the City deal, within that, it's been agreed to establish a transport governance group, and that will comprise of Transport Scotland, the 6 City deal local authority partners, and Sestran, and it's proposed to take the Strategic Transport Project Review 2 project through that group. So, in answer to Councillor Booth's question, the neighbouring local authorities, City deal partners plus Sestran will be part of that process. And this time round with Strategic Transport Project Review 2, it is planned to take that very much forward, I understand, Transport Scotland, on a regional basis rather than at the national level.
Thank you, Ewan. Councillor Gloyer?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Councillor Lang, you mentioned that, and Mr Kennedy also referred to a 12-point list that you'd submitted to officers after you'd seen the text of the report. I wondered if you could maybe expand a little bit on what those 12 points were, so that we know what your contact was in advance of today. So a good example of it, and Keith mentioned it as well, is the fact that one, there was no reference to the LDP in the paper at all, which actually sets up a planning policy framework which includes commitments to access and parking improvements at Dalmeny Station. There was no reference to, for example, that the Council has just spent £75,000 on a traffic study looking at traffic flows around the area. Queensferry, Kirkliston, it was the one that started off, the convener will remember, relating to just the crossroads at Kirkliston, but rightly so, got expanded to take a much more holistic view. And I would have expected something like this to look at the outcomes of that traffic study, given the fact we have invested such a considerable amount of money in it. And to the best of my knowledge, there's been no engagement with the officer who carried out that work. So there's been a lack of joined-up thinking, a lack of joined-up thinking there. A lot of the points that I went back on, Gillian, were really around the timescales. And I mentioned to Councillor Booth before that there are kind of obviously long-term strategic issues, but there are some short-term deliverables. Like one of the things that is mentioned in the paper is looking at whether you could have yellow line restrictions on some of the roads that help in terms of the flow. But again, no timescales, no deadlines, no suggestions. Now, why is that frustrating? It's frustrating because these are not new problems. These have been going on for years and years now. Long predates my time as a councillor, and yet we still don't have clarity as to when we're actually going to get even some of these relatively simple improvements that could make a difference.
Given the fact that we still have to debate the entire report, can I suggest that the following 2 questions and answers are kept relatively brief, please? I'd be grateful for that. We have a long agenda to get through today. I think the next on the list is Councillor Arthur.
So this is quite an interesting problem, because we've got obviously a city-wide report here. Dalmeny is a relatively small but important part of the city transport infrastructure. And what I'm hearing in this discussion is actually, well, it seems that quite a lot of the problems in Dalmeny are caused by traffic perhaps coming from Fife and West Lothian. So I guess the first question I have is, to what extent is the solution to this problem actually outside Dalmeny, in Fife and in West Lothian? And the second question is about this traffic survey, and I guess it's really you that can answer it, is that I think you said it was just completed last month. So is it fair to say that the analysis of that data is not complete yet and it couldn't be presented as part of this report?
So just take your last question first, because it's an absolutely fair one. But again, in terms of joined-up thinking and joined-up decision-making, I would expect there to be some reference at least to the fact that this study has been done, and that we would look again at the results in terms of where we go next with it. And actually, and it does link to your first question, because I think it's a really important one. I'm not totally convinced that the problem at the station is Fife. There's a risk that it's made worse by the fact that there's new park and ride charges being brought in Fife. But as Keith said, we think a big part of it is Kirkliston commuters who are coming up. Again, that traffic study, because it covered Queensferry, Dalmeny and Kirkliston, would help to quantify that. But it's also why it's important to get, for example, a bus link, a proper door-to-door bus link, an extension of 43, so that you're improving access arrangements from Kirkliston to the station itself.
Councillor Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. And I'll just keep this very brief, straight to the point. Would you agree that the majority of traffic that is coming from South Queensferry, Dalmeny direction into Edinburgh is actually not so much heading into the centre of town, but maybe heading down towards Crewe Toll? So how do you encourage people then to use the public transport, trains, buses, that go into this? If I was working there, I'd find that take too much time out of my day.
So I think that is a great example, Convener, of where that does fit into your wider paper. Because, for example, one of the problems that we've got at the moment with a lack of bus prioritisation along the A90 and the Queensferry Road is that if you're taking the bus, you're sitting in the exact same traffic that you'd be sitting in if you were sitting in your car. And at the moment, one of the difficulties is that Lothian and the 43 are not getting the kind of journey time improvements or the differential that I think would make that an even more attractive service. So in terms of folk coming into Edinburgh, the issue is that lack of prioritisation does leave public transport at a distinct disadvantage when you compare that to other parts of the city.
Okay, we've had a very detailed section on this so far. We still have the report to discuss in its entirety. Can I ask Councillor Lang to return to the gallery? Thank you. I think in closing around both the deputation and Councillor Lang's contribution here, and indeed the contributions that we've had from officials, it's absolutely clear that this is a detailed and nuanced situation out in Dalmeny. The solutions are not easy to find. I think it's absolutely clear that while it may not appear in the report, there's been an enormous amount of work undertaken by the officials to try to find solutions. There are a number of strands to that fact-finding, whether it's a traffic study, as alluded to earlier on, but in terms of how we're trying to approach this. We take on board what's been said to us, but I do worry somewhat that the expectations of the report before us today are somewhat unrealistic, because this is a city-wide report that's looking at public transport priority action plan, and it covers a number of areas. Now, if I give some indication that the number of pages that we've expected to read as a committee for this committee alone is well over 500, you can understand why we can't expand within this one particular report into the kind of nuanced detail that I think has been expected, in particular in the contribution from Councillor Lang there. So I think there is a question of managing expectations of what rises to the surface And it's also a question of understanding about what sits behind that in terms of the level of work undertaken by officials and the administration to bring forward these reports. Can we move now to the consideration of the report, please?
Okay, which is item 7.2, Public Transport Priority Action Plan, and I think Ewan is here to present it.
Thank you. The background to this report is really feedback from bus operators within the city who have been for a time now flagging up changing conditions within the city that have been impacting on their ability to deliver reliable services and reporting in variable and increasing journey times. The holy grail of a good public transport system is frequent, fast and reliable. And that's something that we've really benefited from within the city for many years. And the feedback that we're getting is that there is potentially threat coming forward to influence that. The report then goes on to, under a number of headings, and I don't propose to go through them all, to set out some interventions that the Council could implement on the part of the Council. There's obviously a kind of partnership arrangement here. There's certain interventions that the Council can undertake, but obviously there are changes that the bus operators can undertake as well. And it's very much that marrying of the two approaches to delivering success. And historically, this approach has worked in the past, probably most notably in the 1990s with the introduction of greenways. So as I say, I don't propose to go through the various interventions. I think they're fairly well laid out and explained. The only other thing I would add was in reference to the Delaney train station. I would stress that this report has been drafted to address the emotion that was put before Council.
Thank you, Ewan. Do we have any questions from the Councillor Booth?
Thanks, Convener. Thanks very much indeed for the report. And there's a lot in here to welcome. And obviously part of the reason that this report is before us is because those of us who are on the board of Transport for Edinburgh have consistently said we want to see at this committee actions that the Council is taking to address the congestion that impacts on bus operators throughout the city. And there's a lot in here to be welcomed, including the work on the A90, the bus corridor improvements, the A8, and so on. I have a couple of specific questions and one perhaps more general one. In terms of the bus lane enforcement, it says that a separate paper will be submitted to committee once the list of preferred locations has been finalised. Do we have a timetable for when that report will come back? That's my first question. My second question is more generally on bus lane enforcement. I think we've raised in the past that whether there is any potential to use the CCTV cameras on the Lothian buses vehicles to allow us to undertake enforcement, and we've been told consistently the answer is no to that because we do not have the powers to do so. Are we having a dialogue with the Scottish Government about allowing us to have those powers? Because I think using the potential for us to use those cameras to allow enforcement could be quite significant in terms of people parking in bus lanes, for example. I have a specific. I have a lot of sympathy with the arguments for bus stop rationalisation, but I do have some concerns about whether the evidence base for the 400 metres is strong. I understand, for example, that the Transport Research Institute suggests that 400 metres, there is some evidence to support that 400 metres is the threshold over which people will find it inconvenient to walk to their nearest bus stop. That is not quite the same as having a 400-metre gap between bus stops. And and I have some concerns that we need to be very mindful that, in particular, the patronage on our buses quite often will be those who have mobility problems or those who are more vulnerable. And I think we need to ensure that our buses remain accessible to those with mobility problems. So that's 3 questions to start you off. I think that will do for the time being.
Thank you, Councillor Booth. Your first question in terms of timetable for the locations, I think I'll be able to certainly put a business bulletin probably back to the next committee. I'm pretty confident that the decision on the next set of sites is well advanced. Your second question, the issue of the use of cameras is it's founded in the equipment itself. For what is a criminal prosecution, the equipment has to be typed approved by the Home Office, and therefore, so examples would be things like speed cameras, red light running cameras, bus enforcement cameras. So the equipment available to us to be able to use it has to have come with that approval. Other camera equipment that is available and undoubtedly may well be useful doesn't carry with it that type approval. And it is something that we have explored in the past. It's all around, I'm looking at you, looking puzzled, it's all around the evidence base and the fact that that can be verified, it can't be tampered with, etc., that goes with it. We have had dialogue around the use of CCTV cameras on the buses. It undoubtedly would be helpful. I think your basic question is, do we continue that dialogue? And I think the answer to that is yes, on a number of fronts, not just like bus lane camera enforcement. It would be very helpful in other situations, for instance, camera enforcement of pedestrianised areas, camera enforcement of parking, etc., etc. So it is very much a live debate, but normally the difficulty comes from Home Office / Procurator Fiscal Office around the security of the evidence that effectively underpins the prosecution. And your third question, 400 metres is a figure that does come from research. I think it's also supported by Transport Scotland. I don't think we would be absolutely rigid around that figure. I think it's a guide figure. It's 2,500 bus stops in Edinburgh. That's a lot by any standard in the city. And on one side, it's something that's positive. But on the other side, it does impact on the ability to deliver the bus service. And we would very much undertake that rationalisation in a very kind of careful, sensitive way. The way we're kind of thinking of doing it would be along a kind of corridor basis. We've been doing some work on one corridor to see what that looked like, and it would be a very consultative process. And on the pilot one, our intentions would be to kind of monitor that and review it and bring it back to committee. But I don't think we'd be applying absolute rigid rules.
Councillor Booth.
Thanks, Commissioner. Thanks very much for that response. And that does give me some reassurance. I'm glad to see that we wouldn't be applying it rigidly. And I think a consultation would be very welcome, in particular with ward members. And perhaps there's also a role, again, for the locality committees on that. As a supplementary to my middle question, I was looking puzzled because my understanding was that parking enforcement was decriminalised. And your point was that in order for a criminal prosecution, we need a very high standard of equipment. My understanding is that parking enforcement is decriminalised. So have I got that mixed up with bus lane enforcement?
No, you're absolutely correct. Car parking is decriminalised, but the offence in a bus lane is still, it's a moving traffic offence, so that's still criminal.
Thank you, Ewan. Councillor Cook.
Thanks, Convener. To be honest, Ewan, in terms of the spacing of bus stops, you've sort of addressed sufficiently what I was going to raise in terms of not being too rigid. I mean, I think in terms of improving the flow of the buses, I think all parties have recognised for some time, to varying degrees, that that's something that we could address, because the frequency is so much higher in a lot of areas than it is in other cities. But you've sort of hinted at the continued partnership working with Lothian buses, which I think is actually pretty good amongst us all in the council. But also just to sort of acknowledge explicitly that as a council we need to continue to engage with Lothian buses and other things that they can do for their part to help speed things up. I know that we've had discussions about things like new bus designs, two-door designs, speeding up ticketing and things like this, which changes which in themselves seem to produce fairly small and almost insignificant speeds up in time, but cumulatively, you know, along with bus stop sightings, so just to ensure that we keep picking up these specific issues in the round, so we'll have a catalogue of things which added together will actually make quite a significant increase.
Was that a question?
Yeah. Right. Just to acknowledge that we will continue to do that, and it's important that we press Lothian buses on these issues for their part.
Absolutely. I mean, we meet on a very regular basis with Lothian buses, and we have a wider forum for the other bus operators as well.
Indeed, we had a very useful session yesterday, Nick, to which you were invited.
I also met with Lothian buses previously on these issues, as in all each individual group.
Well, it was a cross-party group that we had yesterday, which was turned out to be very useful.
Yes, and I acknowledge the cross-party support for these issues.
Yeah. I think the next on the list is Councillor Gloyer.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to start with something that's not really a question, to come back to Dalmeny Station. I really do think it's regrettable that, particularly, that the Community Council doesn't seem to have been involved in the consultations on this. And I do also find it a bit weird that the motion which Councillor Lang and Councillor Young brought to Council has been addressed by means of rolling it into a report which is basically about buses. I do think that maybe a separate report would have been better all round. However, my question is also about bus stops. And following on from what Councillor Booth and Councillor Cook have said, I mean, when you look at where bus stops are, it's true there are a lot of bus stops, but quite often you see that they're near, for example, sheltered housing or similar developments, very possibly built there precisely because their residents would then have good access to public transport. I can walk 400 metres, but not everybody can, and I'm very glad that that's not going to be a hard and fast measurement thing, because it's not only about 400 metres, they've also got to get from where they live to the main road where the buses pass. So it could be half a kilometre, or maybe even more. It's not, you know, the word unhappy, residents being unhappy, is used in the report. It's not a matter of people being unhappy. Everybody would like bus journey times to be reduced, but not at the expense of making it impossible for our less mobile citizens to move around the city on public transport. I would very much like to ask that the consultation that's done includes, for example, the access panel, maybe going into sheltered housing complexes and talking to the residents about what locations they would like their bus stops to be at, because I think there's a real issue about accessibility. If we try and rationalise things to suit bus operators, it might be at the expense of our citizens. Thank you.
I think I'd like to leap in here at this point and make a couple of comments. One, this report is not about buses. It's about public transport. And it is clear, although buses are clearly a vital and large part of our integrated transport network in the city, it is very much about the wider set of issues. And, you know, one thing that is, I think we're all very conscious of, is the fact that reports cannot cover everything. And phrases like residents may not be happy about, it's an indication, I think, of the degree of care and concern that we've got within the administration and within officials to make sure that we get this right. But we can't nuance that in every report in order to satisfy everybody. I think it is a very clear indication that all of the discussions that we've been having internally agree absolutely with what you've just said. This is not about imposing something on the residents of Edinburgh. This is about serving the residents of Edinburgh and those who are both using the public transport and those who are trying to access it in that sense. So, you know, I'd like that noted, that that's the purpose behind this. It's not an imposition for the ease of bus drivers. It's actually for the ease of the passengers and the residents of Edinburgh. Ewan, did you want to come back on anything specific?
Really, just to acknowledge your points, Councillor Glair. I mean, I've moved bus stops in the 30-odd years I've been here, and I don't underestimate the well, absolutely. There was one I moved in Morningside Road in 1994, and they're still talking about it. So I really do not underestimate the passion and the views held around the locationing of bus stops.
Councillor Arthur, I think you were.
So what I've learned as a councillor in the 18 months or so since I was elected is that everyone wants a bus stop on their street, but not necessarily outside their house. Yesterday I actually caught a bus in Gracemount in Councillor McGuinness's ward, and I think it's fair to say that I could have walked to the next bus stop. It was so close in the time it took for that bus to load. And that's not unusual, and so I think this is a problem we do have to look at. But I think it is about getting the balance right between the needs of loading buses, and there's a lot of that in the report, and also the needs of passengers. The number 16 route is used as an example in the report, and that goes through my ward. So I think over the whole of that route, the saving is estimated to be 5 minutes if that change goes through. So you may be looking at losing perhaps 20–25% of the stops to achieve that kind of saving. But for a typical journey from Oxgang, say, into the city centre, which is probably the typical journey, the saving is only 2.5 minutes. That saving is quite quickly lost for the passenger if they have to walk extra distance from their home to the stop, and then from the destination stop to wherever they're going to shop or wherever. So I think we have to be mindful of the door-to-door journey time rather than the stop-to-stop journey time, if this is actually about getting more people to use the bus. But I've got two questions, and it'd be good if I could just take them in turn, really. The first one is so accepting that this is worth looking at, is what we're doing compatible with the Public and Accessible Transport Action Plan 2013 to 2020?
I hope this isn't a trick question. I would say it was, yes.
Well, a key target in that was increasing the number of households which were within 6 minutes of a bus stop. And in that report also makes reference to what's called the Council's bus-friendly design guidance. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
So it says research suggests that the 200 to 250 metres cut-off walking distance, especially for people with mobility difficulties. Beyond that, bus use, especially by people with walking difficulties, declines rapidly. So there is an issue here. So we do recognise that perhaps some stops are too close together, but there is a risk by removing stops. The most vulnerable people in the city then have less access to public transport. And so at the back of the report, that's not represented as either a qualities issue or as a risk. So I guess what I'm looking for is some reassurance that that's on your radar, and we will consult with groups that have got interest in that area.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not rigid rules here. Almost every bus stop will be looked at on a case-by-case basis. But in the work that we've done thus far, sometimes because of you've got two bus stops so close together, deleting one and moving one by 20 metres is all that's needed. And certainly the pilot that we've been looking at in the A70, that's case in point. But I mean, I think basically the question you asked me, I think it's on the same theme as the ones that have been around, is giving you that reassurance that each bus stop will be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and the needs around it and the impact of any changes brought to bear will be developed, and that will be consulted upon. But the intention here is not to disadvantage or greatly detriment access to bus stops. It's just that we know that across the city there are bus stops that can be managed in a different way without, I think, serious implications.
Councillor Doran.
Thank you, Convener. I think from someone who does suffer from a disability of walking and chronic pain in her back, I walk to quite a long distance because I'm at the top of a hill every day to bus stops, etc. And I do think it's very, very important that people still have full access. For me, it's helpful to me to walk, although it may be quite slow and I look a bit hazy at times. I still walk to my bus stop and home every day. Just a very brief question, Ewan. I am gathering, and I expect that all these sort of difficulties will be looked at during the whole period that we're looking at this, as the report states, and that people's disabilities will, of course, come into that.
Absolutely. And if the balance of opinion and the balance of views is that we don't change it, we don't change it.
Councillor Booth.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, I think, yeah, I share many of the concerns that other councillors have expressed about the bus lanes, but I am reassured that it's not going to be a hard and fast rule. We have an amendment, which I understand you might want to make some verbal changes to, Convener, asking for any final decision to come back here for committee. I think that would be helpful in the sense that it would ensure that any changes that are politically contentious, ward councillors will undoubtedly be in touch with that, and then we can ensure that those that have strong reasons against changes, we can make that final decision. I suppose, just in terms of factual questions, will the final proposal for bus stop changes be subject to equalities impact assessment? And can you give us a commitment that ward members will be consulted as part of that process? And a separate question, which was on my list, which I'd forgotten about previously, apologies, Convener, was in terms of paragraph 1.1.5 about the proposal to allow taxis into those 3 bus gates. Again, will the decision on whether to do that or not, will that come back here to committee? I have some concerns about that. One of these is in my ward. When it was initially set up, part of the reason for not including taxis was to significantly reduce the traffic along that street. And I have concerns that by allowing taxis, we may be increasing. This is about the shore, the bus gate at the shore, and I have concerns that if we allow taxis through there. However, if it's consultation and if it comes back here for a decision, I'm happy with that. So I suppose 3 questions: 1, equalities impact assessment; 2, consultation with ward members on the bus stop removal; and what's the background to the taxis and bus gates, and will it come back here for a decision?
Okay. Yes. And on the third one, to allow taxis to pass through the bus gate will mean that the traffic regulation order will have to be changed. That means it will be advertised and people have the right to object, and any objections will be brought back to committee.
Okay. So is that us finished with questions from the committee? Okay, thank you. I think we now have to move to the amendments, the proposed addendums, sorry. I'll run through the coalition position on these first before we start getting into the proposal and the seconding of each of these. Now, bear with me because there's quite a lot of complicated stuff in all of this in terms of movement around. I think that we are minded to suggest that the first part of the Conservative Group amendment should be morphed somehow into the first paragraph of the Green addendum. I think they're both essentially saying much the same thing. In terms of the coalition acceptance, so I think we would suggest that whilst the spirit is pretty much the same between the Conservative Group addendum and the Green addendum in terms of the second paragraph, i.e. in case of the Green amendment, the insertion of that new paragraph 1.19, I think on that basis we would suggest that we'd step away from the Conservative group amendment and move towards the Green one with the addition of that first part of the Tory amendment. Addendum, sorry. In terms of the Liberal Democrat amendment, I'm noting what Ewan was suggesting about earlier on when we were talking about specifically about the Dalmeny situation, that we come back with a business bulletin update at a short date, and that the rest of it is folded into the strategic and regional review. So, for that reason alone, I think we would step away from this one. That's our position. So, can I invite? Sorry, do you have a question on all of that?
Just a point of clarity, Convener, on 2 points. One is, I think you were going to suggest a small verbal amendment to the first part of our amendment on paragraph 1.14 on bus stop rationalisation, and I just wonder whether it might be acceptable to committee. Obviously, this is a question both for you as convener and for the committee. Whether we, in addition to the steps that you've suggested on Dalmeny, whether we also refer this report on to the North West Locality Committee for consideration of the Dalmeny points.
At the moment, because of course localities are still in how do I say it, stage of development, early stage of development, we're actually not convinced that they have the authority to deal with these particular issues at this level. So I think we're going to wait until after the committee and look at that again. I think it's quite clear from the administration that our intention is to deal with this issue. I think if we can deal with it within the outline I've just given in terms of the business bulletin, it is at least a useful stepping stone towards us achieving some degree of agreement on that. So that's my position on that. In terms of 1.1.4, which I think was what you were referring to in terms of my verbal agreement, first of all, thank you for the reminder. That was my intention. The intention there was really to reflect some of the correspondence that I've had from interested groups who are raising correctly issues around equalities on this. So my suggested verbal amendment to that would be 1.1.4, approves the recommendation of a desired spacing of 400 metres between bus stops, and that existing corridors are reviewed to determine how this spacing can be achieved, with an addition of, whilst recognising the equalities issues related to this. It's simply a reference to the fact that we are aware of those issues and that we are going to be taking those into account.
And are you confirming that the decision on any moves of bus stops will come back to committee?
Yes, I thought we had agreed that, yeah. Okay, now this is quite a complicated path through. Right, so you're asking too much of my brain right now. It's been a long week so far.
Sorry, I think...
Yes, I'll ask Veronica to step in on this one.
I think just let me know if I've got this wrong, but I think it's to approve the recommendation of a desired spacing of 400 metres between bus stops and that existing corridors are reviewed to determine how the spacing can be achieved, whilst recognising the equalities issues raised by this, is that correct? Yeah, and that a full public consultation will be carried out on any proposed changes, with a consultation report returning to this committee to seek approval for any changes to bus stop locations.
Committee comfortable with that? Thank you. Now, we still have to step our way through all of these addendums, so can I invite Councillor Cook to speak to his?
That's Chazzy's one, not mine. Convener, I'll be fairly brief because I think we've managed to reach a full cross-party consensus on where we're going on this, which is rare but I think welcome. In the last iteration of the Council, there's only 2 or 3 of us who are on the committee who overseen these changes in reduction of bus lane operating hours, which are subject to a trial and was then made permanent without objections from public transport operators at the time. But I think in the longer term, in the preceding 2 or 3 years, it's been a an acknowledgement that perhaps that wasn't the best thing to do. So I do think that whilst it's important for public transport flow and improving public transport flow that we look at increasing these hours, I do think we have to consult to see how we can mitigate the issues around loading, around parking, around business access, with actually improving traffic flow, particularly in the city centre, and whether we would want full day operation in the city centre and perhaps not out with all bus lanes in the periphery. Different things that we can do around this, but I think it's important that we go back out and ask what people think about this, to look at how we can improve bus flow in the city centre and across the city. So with the changes the committee's agreed, I'm pleased to see that we'll be doing that and we'll be revisiting this issue. I don't think I'm still actually formally moving. Am I still formally moving this, or?
I don't think there's.
No,
you're just going to withdraw it.
Yeah, so I've spoken, yeah, I'll now withdraw it.
Because essentially the content will be then morphed into the Green Amendment. So can we move now to Councillor Booth, please?
Thanks, Convener. And likewise, I'm delighted that we appear to have reached consensus on this. I do think I agree with Councillor Cook that we need to listen to the bus operators on the 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. 7 days a week. I think if we can go to consultation on that, we do, as Councillor Cook says, need to take businesses with us on that and need to carefully consider what the impacts will be. There's a lot of excellent work in here, and I would like to commend officers for the time and effort that they've put into it. It's really good news, and I'm delighted that we seem to have a cross-party consensus on this.
So are you proposing your... Right, OK, and do you have a seconder for the form that we've sort of cobbled together, shall we say? I have only one comment on it before we come to Councillor Gloyer, and I apologise for raising this after you've proposed it, because I know that that's not the correct way to do it, but I'm going to raise it. In your, at the end of paragraph 1.1.4, you talk about consultation report returning to this committee to seek approval for any changes to bus stop locations. I have a slight concern about that, and it's about the scale that that could morph into. So in other words, do we have 2,500 bus stop locations come back to us for individual approval? And that's clearly not the intention behind this. This is about both the pilot and the principles that will emerge from that in terms of how we then apply it across the rest of the city. So I'm just concerned about that one particular word in your motion. And I wonder if you'd be willing to drop that without really the change behind the intent of it.
Yes, happy to do that.
Thank you very much. Councillor Gloyer.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think the Community Council Chairman and the Ward Councillor have gave us a very clear and detailed explanation of the issues that are in contention here. It's clear further discussions are clearly needed on this, and I welcome the commitment that was made earlier to move ahead with that. I am relaxed about the report on these further discussions being made through the business bulletin, but I hope that you would still be prepared to accept that the timescale of one cycle could be left in, because I think we need some kind of timescale on this, and as Councillor Lang said, 10 months have already gone by since the original motion that he brought to full council, and it would be a pity for it to go on for longer than a year.
Sorry, just to clarify, Councillor Gloyer, are you willing to accept the administration's suggestion that this comes back as a business bulletin item?
Yes, yes, absolutely. That's
one
fine.
cycle. So you're happy for your amendment to be adjusted to reflect that?
That it refers to the business bulletin, yes, within one cycle.
Yeah.
That's.
And do you have a seconder?
Yes. I'll second it.
Okay, I don't think there's any requirement for a vote because we have reached a consensus, but just to clarify what the decision is, I think committee are minded to approve the recommendations in the report, and sorry, you're going to have to bear with me for a second, with the the Conservative addendum has been dropped.
She's come to the
Okay, so
that first paragraph is morphed into.
Yes.
I know this is tortuous.
Yeah, that's fine.
The first paragraph is morphed into. It's added into the green first paragraph.
That's fine. Do you want to move any part of your addendum? Amendment, sorry.
You didn't, did you? You withdrew it.
Just formally then.
Okay, that's fine. So we're approving the recommendations in the report. We're accepting the green addendum with the insertion at paragraph 1.1.4 of whilst recognising the equalities issues raised by this, and that a full public consultation will be carried out on any proposed changes, with a consultation report returning to this committee to seek approval for changes to bus stop locations and the removal of the word any. And I think the committee are minded to accept the amendment by the Liberal Democrat group, which is seconded by Councillor Doran, that a report will come back, not a report will come back, this will be reported back in the Business Bulletin in one cycle, and that further discussions will take place with ward councillors and the Community Council, from which a more detailed action plan should be developed. Is that acceptable to the committee? Okay, thank you.
Can I thank the committee for bearing with us? That's almost an hour and a half we spent on the first item. Given the fact we've got 19 items, I trust you've all brought your sleeping bags with you. Food will not be provided. So we'll move on to the second one. Thank you.
Okay, that takes us back then to item 4.1 on the agenda, which is the minutes of the meeting of the 20th of June 2018, submitted for approval as the correct record.